Take a look at this painting. You might be thinking, what's this got to do with railways? Well, if I tell you that through 350 million years of compaction and the right conditions, that this will become this, it's a bit of a aha moment. The beauty about coal is that it has a lot of energy potential, and one of the larger fields in the UK was the rich fields of Northumberland. As the resources to obtain coal from the ground were limited for over 1,000 years, coal would be obtained from seams close to the surface or from sea coalers. These were people that would rake up coal from beaches after it washed up from the sea. Although some coalers could harvest up to a ton a day, it wasn't enough to sustain any heavy industry. By 1750, small-scale mining operations were beginning to develop. Brick-lined shafts were able to go deeper than ever before, and rudimentary rail carts were used to bring out the coal. The carts were basic, and the rails would have been wooden and prone to breakage. The majority of carts would have been pushed by hand, and larger chains with a horse at its head. Considering the state of the roads at the time, moving large quantities of coal was very slow going. For centuries, people and business owners alike used waterways to get their goods from A to B. However, they had to rely on natural watercourses, which would eventually develop. Towns such as Hull and London would prosper, but for those inland with no natural river system big enough to develop, they would struggle. So if rivers didn't go into the industries brought the rivers to them. The UK was home to the first ever nationwide canal network. It transformed freight movements never before seen in history. Barges could carry anything from coal to cotton. Nothing was off the cards. The network was so successful it started to affect the price of raw materials as they were now more plentiful. On the 9th of November 1767, several engineers, inventors and designers came together at the post house in Darlington with a view to looking into a canal from the rich coalfields of Durham to Cleveland, where the companies can send the coal to London and further afield easier, and more importantly, cheaper. The proposed canal would be 33 miles long, 16 foot wide and 5 foot deep, and it were promising. But when it was looked into further, a canal simply wouldn't work. The terrain and the high altitude made a canal impractical. There was also a brief revival a few years later, however the plan was quickly shelved. In 1781, Robert and Mabel Stevenson welcomed their second child, a son named George. Robert was a hard-working man and was a fireman for the Welham Colliers in Northumberland. George's childhood would have been short, as he had no formal education, and it was likely he started work as early as the age of 10, most likely following in his father's footsteps to train as a fireman, then as an engineman at the Waterroad Pit. By the age of 17, George was allowed to be in control of the main pumping engine, a serious and important job. He had the miners' lives in his hands, his careful handling that kept the punt running and the water at bay. A year later, George took on a well-paid job looking after the winding engine that took the miners up and down. After his marriage in 1802, he moved to the Willington Colliery, where he was under the stewardship of Robert Hawthorne. Hawthorne put a lot of trust in George, as the winding engine he operated was a new design and the first of its type in that county. George must have been inspired by Hawthorne and learnt that to get any sort of progress he needed to be schooled. He paid 3p a lesson to a local school teacher to teach him to read and write. In 1803 his son Robert was born, and George was determined his son would get the education he lacked. George would suffer heartbreak just 3 years later, when his wife died, so he brought his sister in to look after Robert as he grew. He continued to work up the ranks, and his keen eye to detail in his hard work began to pay off. But in 1811 he had his golden moment, after he offered to repair an atmospheric pumping engine at his new job at the High Pit in Killingworth. The pump was looked at by some of the best mechanics around. None of them succeeded, so George asked if he could have a go. The bosses agreed, and within a few hours the engine was working again. The main employers, impressed, promoted George to engine wright and increased his salary to £100 a year. The extra income allowed him to send Robert to university. Meanwhile, engineers gathered at Darlington again to debate the coal movements. Another survey was carried out, and a canal was proposed, but this canal would service Darlington itself. At the same time, George's reputation and keen eye for machines had caused a stir in the mining world. He had gone from repairing machines to building his own, and he was allowed to work for rival mines for a retaining fee. The success had reached the ears of those in attendance. This, coupled with the locomotive successes elsewhere, made the engineers pause. Would they go with a canal or attempt a railway? George, however, would take a pause from his engine work when a tragic explosion hit Tyneside. He looked closer at what the miners were doing and quickly realised that a mix of candles and naked flame and underground gas was a recipe for disaster. The miners had no choice. They needed light to work. Through manipulation of air and trial and error, he created a safety lamp. Trouble though brewed when he presented his idea, as well-known and upper-class scientist Samuel Davy had designed a lamp that worked in the same principle. Although Davy laid claim he invented it first, it was George that had tested his design first. The two claims caused a fierce rift between the two men. Davy would use the press to smear George, calling him out for his social standing and lack of education. And in the end, George had to go on the defence. But thanks to his friends, he was awarded £1,000 and a tankard for his efforts, although his experience with Davy would cement a large distrust of the upper classes that he would carry for the rest of his life. By 1818, Stockton businessman Christopher Tennant chose to throw his hat into the fray. He chaired another meeting where the grandsons of the original meeting were in attendance. He proposed a new canal from Stockton to the collieries at Evenwood. It would contain a massive 50 locks to cope with the hills, and would be able to accommodate barges that would carry up to 60 tons of coal apiece. The plan went down like a lead balloon with the Darlington lot. A canal of this magnitude would elevate Stockton as a coal powerhouse, while leaving Darlington behind. Besides, they had the idea first. The Darlington men raced home. Stockton had an early lead in the canal race and was already heading to Parliament to get the approval. If granted, Darlington would have no hope due to the canal's size and proximity. On the 4th of September 1818, an emergency meeting was held to discuss the problem. It was obvious a full canal was proving too problematic, so a half railway, half canal was proposed. But attendee Jonathan Cairns advised he would propose a survey. He did it in record time and advised to track the entire lot. Finally, Darlington had a plan and pushed forward with the proposal of a railway. In an attempt to throw Stockton an olive branch, they called the company and the line the Stockton and Darlington Railway. The railway would be the longest anyone had ever built before, with several branch lines to Yarmcroft and Piercebridge. These branch lines would cause many backers to lean towards the railway rather than the canal. It was cheaper, and the coal output predicted greater. Lead engineer Joseph Blackhouse had the job of gathering capital and contacted investors up and down the country. Meanwhile, Stockton was struggling with the canal. In the end, it was ditched in place of another railway, not the Stockton and Darlington, but another line called the Tees and Weardale Railway. Stockton's railway would still be separate from Darlington and Yarm, and still wanted to charter its own course. The Stockton and Darlington Railway was almost ready to start laying track. When the canal idea was proposed, several landowners signed up and agreed to use their lands as part of the project in return for compensation. This included lands belonging to the 3rd Earl of Darlington, William Henry Vale. The majority of the land was prime hunting grounds and the best fox hunting land in the area. The railway presumed that the grounds and the support would just carry forward. However, when the Earl had heard that Darlington had ditched the canal idea for a railway, he was furious. This loud clanking thing would effectively cut his hunting grounds in half. He was influential in Parliament and used his power to make his point known. Other like-minded people could see his point. If the country was cut by these new engines, their pastimes would suffer. He made his point so clear that the application was doomed to fail. But the Stockton and Darlington had a comeback. Several supporters went to every MP's home to challenge and gather support directly, and support started to return. The Earl was in the middle of hunting when a servant went up to him to hand him a letter. It was marked urgent, and his contents put him in a fury so large he called off the hunt and there and then made a plan to go back to London and lobby again. He got his way and the application was refused, but by the narrowest of margins. Once again, the railway was ready. This time, they petitioned an amended bill, skirting round the hunting grounds. But the Earl wasn't finished yet. He wanted to break the railway. How dare they try to upstage him? Now, some of you may remember me explaining in a previous video that before the Bank of England Bank would produce their own banknotes. A lesser known fact about these notes is that they could be presented to the named bank and then exchanged for its physical value in gold. In the days of small banks and no digital means, gold was one of the only ways to prove a bank's worth. If it didn't have the appropriate funds, then it would have to close, causing a run and eventual financial ruin. The Earl's plan was very simple. He would ask all of his tenants to keep back any notes issued by Backhouse's Bank, the bank that the railway was using, and then he would collect them with the rent. He then would present every single note all in one go and insist it be turned into gold. Now, the idea was laughable for most, but the Earl was exceptionally rich, and it didn't matter if the Earl had any accounts. If he had the banknotes, he could ask for the bullion, and if he succeeded, gold reserved for other projects would need to be diverted, that being the railways, and the bank would be left with nothing but a few printed scraps of worthless paper. Luckily, bank manager Jonathan Backhouse heard rumours of this plan and sped to London. He secured a full case of bullion from fellow bankers and loans and put it in a stagecoach. He escorted the precious cargo back to Darlington on a 96-hour run. It transpired he had over £2 million of raw gold with him just to pay the debt. He was just 3 miles off Darlington when a wheel smashed. The manager was frantic as he heard from locals that the Earl's agent was on the way with bags of notes collected over several months. Jonathan knew he couldn't repair the coach in time, but he could use the bullion to help. He moved the bullion over the good axle and the stagecoach wobbled upright. He ordered the driver to drive carefully, but he made it to the office with just minutes to spare. Bold as brass, the Earl's agent came towards the counter and requested the bullion. I can only imagine the agent's face when the bank simply gave him the gold with a simple smile and like the transaction was commonplace. The manager even had some gold left over, so the bank saw no repercussions except for a charge for a broken wheel. So the line was redirected to avoid the Earl's land for good, and it was to their benefit as the route was shorter by about 9 miles. So all was in place for yet another reading, when something happened that no one expected. King George III was not a well man. He had severe mental illness that rendered him incapable of rule, so his son George ran the country as a regent. The king had reached the age of 81, which was considerable given the time period. However, he was blind, deaf, and incapable of understanding anything, and he passed of pneumonia. For the railway, this spelt trouble. Although the king was under the control of a regent, the death of a monarch also spelt the death of the current parliament. All the support the railway had was gone, and while all waited for parliament to reconvene, the railway's plans were on hold. Days before the King's funeral, the railway bosses gathered at the George and Dragon pub in Yarm. The mood was despondent, but for the sake of this line and the town, the founders doubled down. They refused to give up. There had been too much to just stop. But out of both respect to the dead king and to give the surveyors more time to put more detail into the survey, the engineers decided to sit back and wait. It was concluded that the elections would be held in March and April of that year, and again the railway bosses lobbied for MPs in their own towns that gave them support. All of their hard work paid off, and MPs loyal to the cause once again graced Parliament. Suddenly the shift against the railway changed. More and more influential people spoke up for the railway, and a third reading was scheduled for the February of 1821. The pioneers crossed their fingers and almost cheered when the bill passed the first reading and then the second. The bill had gone further than ever and reached the select committee stage. It was hoped it would be plain sailing, but the committee refused to sit and hear the bill. A technicality meant the railway was £7,000 short, and the committee refused to sit due to it. Edward Pease would come to the rescue and would submit the shortfall from his own pocket on top of the investment he had already declared. It passed the committee stage, and on the 19th of April it would receive royal assent.